My name's Kirstine. Just in case we haven't met before, I'm one of the leaders here. I'm one of the people that they are referencing when Kirstine talks about trying to find us jobs. Come on, Kirstine. Guys. And we've been on a series in the evening service looking at real encounters. Bola kicked it off a few weeks ago. She looked at a real encounter with power. Last week, Alex spoke on healing. It's worth catching up on both of those talks if you haven't done. And tonight, I'm going to be talking about an encounter with Jesus where grace is on offer. And before we jump into tonight's passage, which is in John 8, I just want to jump back a chapter and look at John 7, because really it sets the scene and the context for what we're going to be looking at. And so what happens is thousands of Jews have gathered. They've gathered together for the Festival of the Tabernacles. Thousands of Jews have gathered together, and they're there in order to remember how God was faithful to their ancestors in the wilderness. And part of this festival would have involved a daily ritual which involved thanking God for the waters of the past year, the rains of the past year, and asking him to provide again for the following year. And it's kind of in that context that they've kind of gathered together. And everybody expects Jesus to turn up to the festival, which he does. And it's in this festival that he starts teaching. And basically, the reason this is important for us to know is what happens as he starts to preach is that there's a debate around his identity, and it starts to intensify. And it also, it kind of arouses this kind of real debate, particularly amongst the Pharisees, as to who Jesus actually truly is. And we see this in chapter 7, verse 37. Jesus says this: "Let anyone who is thirsty come to me and drink water. Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." And it's this claim regarding who Jesus is. It's this claim to his identity that he's made that inflames this debate amongst the Pharisees. Because to the Jewish audience who are listening, this claim is suspiciously close to a claim about God in Isaiah 55, where it says this: "Come, all who are thirsty, come to the waters." And the Pharisees are enraged about the claim that Jesus is making because they adhered strictly to the law of Moses. They believed that God had given the law to Moses, they'd given the understanding to Moses, and they also instructed Moses on how the laws should be applied to the people. And it's the Pharisees who in their day are doing exactly the same thing. They are capable of understanding the law. They share the law with the community, and they ensure that the law is being followed and adhered to. They were the spiritual authority to which people looked. And yet here is Jesus, son of a carpenter, interpreting the law differently. He's not trained by a rabbi who they can verify. He's healing people on the Sabbath. He's showing mercy where he shouldn't be. He's pouring out love and grace indiscriminately. He's challenging their spiritual authority on their turf. So you can kind of start to understand where the Pharisees are coming from, right? They're confused about this message that Jesus is bringing. It is offensive to them. You see, the Pharisees, they had this understanding of the law, and more importantly, they had an expectation on who the Messiah was going to be. And Jesus isn't living up to it. They've got their understanding of who the Messiah is going to be from historical and cultural expectations. A Messiah who would be a conquering leader, who would restore Israel's political prominence, who would deliver them from oppression of the Roman Empire. And Jesus is not doing those things. In fact, Jesus is preaching about a spiritual kingdom. Jesus is claiming to be the fulfillment of the law. Jesus is offering forgiveness for sins, for salvation. And he's talking about a different reign of God's kingdom. It doesn't match what the Pharisees believe to be true. So you can start to see, can't you, how the Pharisees are feeling when Jesus talks and he makes his claims to be Son of God, promised Messiah, fulfillment of the law. And so the Pharisees get together and they conduct a plan. They decided to create a trap that would ultimately discredit Jesus by posing a question about the interpretation of the law, which would prove that Jesus was not a lawkeeper. They believed that Jesus couldn't possibly answer this question without causing his popularity to fade, because he wouldn't be able to do it. And it would mean that their issues with him disappear. So hold that context of why tonight's story happens in the forefront of your mind as we read the passage. So John 8, starting at verse 2. At dawn, he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commands us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write on the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." Again, he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the oldest ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condoned you?" "No, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condone you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So overnight, this woman's been caught in the act of adultery, and I do that for a reason. Because I don't know about you, but when I read this passage, it throws up some questions for me. First of all, how has this woman been caught in the act of adultery? Second of all, let's point out the obvious. Where's the man? Because she wasn't caught having sex by herself. We all know that as a two-person's act, it requires the man in this case. So where the hell is he? When she's facing impending doom, he is where to be told? Certainly not facing that. What could Jesus possibly have written on the ground that had such an impact? And why do the religious leaders, having created such a plan, simply walk away? It leaves us with questions. And what I want to start by saying is that this story is not about the scandal of this woman. It is not about the shame that she faces. Although, do not get me wrong, both those things are important. It is not the core of the story. The core of this story sits with Jesus, his identity, and his claims to offer grace to all people. That's what the core of this story is about. Jesus, who defies expectation, defies protocol, defies our understanding of right and wrong, and calls out a despicable, misogynistic, and evil act for exactly what it is, and then lands with more grace, more love, more hope for a system that is messed up, broken, and doesn't work. So let's take a look at the trap. Now, for this woman to be caught in the act of adultery, and again, caught, it would require two witnesses that are certain they have seen happen what they're claiming has happened. I don't know about you, but again, you've got to be up close and personal. If you think that they're actually having sex for real, you've got to be pretty close to that, not just peeking through a little window, I don't believe. Two people would have had to have seen it at exactly the same time and be willing to testify that this was what happened. Now, interestingly, and I've referenced the fact the man is nowhere to be found. That's one part of it. What's actually interesting is that the Pharisees have set this trap to show that Jesus is not a lawkeeper when they're in breach of the law themselves by not having the man there, because actually the law of Moses states that both parties who committed adultery should be stoned, not just the woman. Okay, I was quite relieved to find that out. Patriarchal society, both people should be stoned to death. Another interesting fact, come on women, stick with me here. Another interesting fact actually is it wasn't common in that time and age to stone people. In fact, it would have be seen as an extremely harsh punishment by the local community. And in fact, it was only the Roman Empire who had the authority to execute people. There are several flaws in their trap, right? This isn't about this woman caught in the act of adultery. She's simply a pawn in their plan. This entire and utter trap is in order to discredit Jesus. That's what they're out to do. Jesus has a couple of options. Either he upholds the law and stones her, but this would be in opposition to the teaching that he's been doing around town. Also, by upholding the law of Moses, Jesus would then be under great threat of being arrested by the Roman Empire himself, because the act of stoning him would be seen as an insurgent against them. On the other hand, he could let her go, right? However, in front of all of the people who've adhered to and stick to the Jewish law, it would seem that he does not do that. So it feels like a bit of a clever plan by the Pharisees. But as I've already said, their plan is pretty flawed. It exposes them to a desperate situation as their religion and their religious beliefs rejects grace. You see, religion disapproves of individuals who operate beyond the established system that they have so painfully built up, and it refuses to allow any exemptions, and there's no free passes when it comes to religion. You see, religion hates grace, the very thing on offer here. And the problem is, Jesus is grace. It's not a concept, but a person. So you can start to see the issues that we're facing. And what is Jesus' response to this trap that he finds himself in? Well, he writes in the dust. He bends down and writes in the dust. Now, it does not tell us what he writes, and there's loads of scholarly debate on it. I had a great time reading what lots of different people think that he may or may not have written. I quite like the idea of people kind of pondering, because we don't know. Scripture doesn't tell us. But there are a few thoughts. Possibly, it's a passage in Jeremiah. Lord, you are the hope of Israel. All who forsake you will be put to shame. Those who turn away from you will be written in the dust, because they have forsaken the Lord, the spring of living water. This is a really popular one, okay? And you can kind of see why, right? The Pharisees are there and they're rejecting Jesus, Lord. And he writes in the dust, and he's already referenced being the very living water that they're seeking. So quite possibly it is a reference to this. Maybe he wrote the names of the Pharisees. Maybe he writes the name of the woman. Maybe he's making a prophetic act whilst he asks God for insight and wisdom on how to respond to the situation of which he's found himself. I don't think it actually matters what he's written in the dust. What matters is the reaction it has and the impact it has on the people that are around. Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her, he says. And actually what Jesus is doing was referring back to the law in Deuteronomy, that the witnesses to the crime must be the ones to throw the first stone. And the witnesses to the crime must have seen this happening. They must be in no doubt as to what they saw and witnessed. And they must be completely clear of any wrongdoing in the act, so says the law. And so there's this moment of this showdown. And what Jesus is saying is, okay, I've heard you. I know the law. Let me just clarify for you, though. If you witnessed this, and you've been willing to testify as to what this woman has done, then you must in no way, shape, or form be in any form of wrongdoing. You must not be complicit with any plan against her or against me. Because if you were, then you yourself have committed a sin. And so you can't throw that first stone, actually. He's cleverly pointing out that not the Pharisees, not the teachers of the law, not anybody in the crowd, not this woman, not you or I can keep the law, actually. We, all of us, fall short. And so he makes his point. You have tried to lay a trap. You have made a victim out of this woman. You have despised the mercy that I am here to bring, and I am no fool. You can feel the tension in the crowd. And he bends down to write again. And you can kind of picture it, can't you? He's bent down, he's laid down his claim, he's laid down his plan back at them. He's writing in the sand again. And in Middle Eastern culture, they would have looked around to see what the elders did next. I wonder how many of them had a stone in their hand. How many of them now carry that weight? Can feel the roughness of the stone as they ponder what to do. What will their response be? Those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left there, with the woman standing still. They walk away. The Pharisees, the teachers of the law, the crowd, the ones who were just ready to stone her. They walk away, leaving Jesus with the woman. In just sheer moments, Jesus has completely and utterly silenced her accusers. The courtyard's emptied, and he stands there with her. And then he says to her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condoned you?" "No one, sir," she says. "Then neither do I condone you. Go now and leave your life of sin." This scandalous grace, this exchange takes place. Her shame gone, grace for you. You can go now. Go, I do not condone you. Jesus never condones us. He does not make us feel shameful. He offers us scandalous grace. Religion can so often hold us in a place of condemnation. It's formed around a structure that so commonly says, climb this ladder, do these things to get to the top. And so often we can find ourselves caught in these structures where we go up this ladder and we try our best to be our best person, to do the very right thing in the eyes of God and in the eyes of religion. And it feels quite good, doesn't it, when you're on that ladder and you're a little bit higher and you can look down on others, let's be honest, and be like, at least I'm not like them. The problem with that, though, is there are people above you thinking exactly the same about you and about I. But Jesus breaks the condemnation that so often we can face. Jesus stands before us and offers us grace. He stands before us and says, I love you as you are. It's this free offer that's available. I just want to acknowledge the last line of this where it says, go now and leave your life of sin. In other translations, it says, go now and sin no more. It's one of only 2 times that phrase appears in the Gospels, sin no more. The other one is actually when Jesus heals the man at the pool and he tells the man to pick up his mat and carry it off, and he's healed him on the Sabbath. Both of these situations, amongst others in the Gospels, it can appear like Jesus has a total and utter disregard for the law. And so you can understand the Pharisees' anger around it. And so what I think is actually happening in that line is that what Jesus is saying to her and to the man at the pool and to us and to the people who've experienced the grace and love and freedom of Jesus is he's saying, do you know what, these men, they're missing it. They didn't get the goodness and grace that I offer you, and they're angry because you have not earned it, and yet I freely give it to you. They're willing to use your brokenness. They're willing to use you as a pawn in their plan to get to me, because of what I do is so offensive to them. Don't let them do that to you. Don't give them any weapons. Jesus wasn't going to stay in that town. He's going on to other towns. There's no doubt that those Pharisees have got eyes on that woman. Part of what Jesus is saying to her is, do you remember how it felt when you were shamed, when you were called out for your behavior in front of a crowd? Do you remember how that felt, that judgment? Remember how you feel now, with grace and mercy and freedom and love. Remember how you feel in this encounter with me. Remember that I have set you free. Remember the relief that is an offer in this moment. Remember this grace that is radically poured out for you, woman. This grace that is poured out for the man that you were with. This grace that is poured out for these Pharisees who are rejecting me. The grace that is poured out for you and I sat here today. This grace is freely available, so remember it. Remember it. It's a scandalous grace. Grace is God's goodness showered on people who have failed. It's God's love for those who think they're totally and utterly unlovable. That's what I found interesting about some of the stories we heard, right? So often we can have things happen to us or we're a part of that make us feel unlovable, who make us feel shamed, who make us feel full of guilt. Grace takes all of that away. Grace is the offer of God's love. It is the offer of redemption. It's God believing in us when we have given up on ourselves. It's the unleashing of his transformative power. It realigns and reroutes our lives. It takes people as they are. It empowers us. It forgives us. It frees us. It gives us transformation. Anne Lamott, who's a writer, says this about grace. I do not understand the mystery of grace, only that it meets us where we are, but it does not leave us there. So that's the beauty of grace. It meets us where you are, as you are, but it will totally transform you if you allow it to. Like others here that have been referenced already today, I used to have huge levels of shame I just wouldn't talk about. And I'll be honest, most of it was because of stuff I was doing. It was like my own behaviour that I knew wasn't good. You know when you know, let's be honest. We've all got that thing we do that we know we really shouldn't be doing, but we do it anyway. And I just had these levels of shame. And I had shame about stuff that was done to me that definitely was not my shame, but I still felt it. And then there's that worldly shame, right? Like I feel shame because I am a certain way. And the world tells me I shouldn't be like that. So therefore I feel shamed for it. And I remember several moments when I would come before God and let that shame out. And in exchange, I'd feel radically loved. Radically loved. Peace that transcends all understanding. And that shame would just be taken away, because that's what Jesus does. Paul, one of the apostles in the New Testament, is one of my favourite people to think about when I'm thinking about grace. He went from persecuting Christians to converting them when he had an encounter of God's grace, and his life is literally turned upside down. In his letters, and there's loads of them, he writes this to the Galatians, but God, who set me apart from my mother's womb, called me by his grace. In Romans 1:5, we receive grace and apostleship called to the Gentiles of obedience that come through faith. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. Paul goes on and on, for it is grace that you have been saved. Grace after grace after grace. Grace for each and every one of us, even the people we don't particularly like. Grace. Because it's not ours to give away. It's God's. And he gives it for everyone. Doesn't always make sense, I admit that. But grace doesn't need to be right. Grace is unrelenting, unchanging love for each and every one of us. So let me ask you this question. As you listen to that story, who is it that you most identified with? Maybe you're here and you're like the crowd. You don't necessarily believe in Jesus. You're trying to work out who he is. Is he truly Messiah, Son of God? Or is he just a nice guy? Maybe you're a religious person who believes that Jesus is wrong about the claims he makes. Admittedly, there may not be many Jewish law observers here tonight, but we will have people who adhere to other spiritual practices. Spiritual practices that do not acknowledge that Jesus is Son of God. We're in a really interesting period, culturally, I'm talking about, in terms of our approach to spirituality, actually. We particularly like a DIY approach to spirituality at the moment, so you kind of pick and choose what you like. I don't think we generally think that God doesn't exist. We generally like to think about a higher power, sort of an alternative power that we can choose for ourselves, define for ourselves as we want to. Interestingly, there's some new research projects that are starting to show that we really value rituals. And it's kind of been going on for a few years. On TikTok, there's a subset called Witch Talk, and that was particularly where this kind of ritual things come out of. But now we do seem to be turning to other practices. We want rituals. There's a new love for religion. But not a religion like we think of it. Religion for music and poetry and meditations. And there's this kind of new wave of spirituality happening again amongst us. And it points to this desire to want to connect with something outside of ourselves, something beyond ourselves. But let me just say, if you're here and you are playing with other forms of spirituality, be that tarot cards and astrology, be it crystals, be it manifestation, none of that is compatible with the gospel of Jesus. Jesus is ultimate truth. He is the Messiah. He is the Son of God. He is the only one who will bring relief to your soul. And all of that seeking and searching in other places will not do that. It is not possible to have your crystals or your Buddhist temples Monday to Friday and have Jesus on a Sunday. That is not the way the Christian faith works. Jesus and Jesus alone will bring rest to your soul. That's seeking and searching in other places. You're not going to find the answer. When I was praying for this talk, I particularly think there's a woman here and you've been going to the shop in Covent Garden that has a white front. It's a place where you can buy crystals. You are not going to find relief in that place. You will not find relief. Even if it seems to be working now, it will not work. The only place that you will find relief is in Jesus. And if you're here and that speaks to you, then do come and speak to me after the service because I would love to pray with you. Maybe you're the woman in the story. Maybe you've been exploited. Maybe you're sat here, you're full of shame and guilt, be it something that's done to you, something you've done to yourself. Maybe that's the person you identify most with. Well, know that Jesus is here. And he wants to bring peace to you. Maybe you're here and you're a believer in Jesus, in which case you understand that he did not come to break the law, but to completely fulfill it. And when Jesus dies on the cross, he bears the penalty for sin and for law breaking, and he does it for each and every one of us. He does not dispute that sin leads to death, but he deals with it by taking our place. And you will know that mercy triumphs over judgment. And that's why Jesus shows mercy to this woman. Mercy over judgment every single time. Every single time. It's important for me to say that grace does not mean that our sinful and law-breaking behavior is okay. God's active judgment on sin is that it will hurt. It will hurt him, it will hurt us, it will possibly hurt those around us. Sin always matters. But there is spiritual power in being able to look God our Father in the face. I don't know about you, but I know certainly for myself, when I'm full of shame because of the thing that I've done that I shouldn't have done, I find it really hard to look God in the face, actually. I kind of want to do this. I'll pray for the work of the church. I'll pray for the other stuff, but I won't actually bring my stuff to God because actually I just can't, right? Because I know that I've done that wrong thing again. But the truth is that God already knows it. He's not sat there judging me or condemning me. He's sat there saying, Kirsty, I love you, come to me. Come and receive grace again. Come and be filled afresh with the Spirit, because when I don't go to God, when I choose to actively turn away from him, I cannot be filled with the Spirit. I cannot do the stuff that he calls me to, and therefore I do not get to use my gifts in the way he intends, and the very same is true for all of us. God is not sat there in a place of condemnation. He's sat there wanting us to go to him. We're all going to mess up, right? But we're in the same boat with that. We continually, myself and all of us, need God's grace and mercy all of the time. I also think it's worth acknowledging that so many of us don't feel worthy of grace, so we just want to reject it, right? Like, I'm not worthy enough for that grace. I get what you're saying, Kirst, but I'm just not worthy. It's probably the most common thing I hear at the moment in regards to grace. We're more comfortable flogging ourselves, right? Like, woe is me, I'm a bad person, I cannot come to God. Well, it's the exact opposite of what God wants us to do. He loves you. The truth is, none of us deserve grace. Of course we don't. None of us can earn it. We can't buy it. We can't bargain with God to get it. We all suffer from the human tendency to just screw things up. The vitality and health of our planet, our communities, our relationships, and even our own bodies. But hear this, it's in our failing and in our weaknesses and in our mistakes that is God's perfect entry point to meet with us. So let's be very clear tonight. Grace is not a free gift from God. Sorry, grace is a free gift from God. I'm dyslexic in case we can't remember that, church. Grace is a free gift from God. It's freely given to you. You cannot earn it, buy it, or bargain for it. Grace is also not a past tense activity that happened when Jesus walked the earth. It is a current day happening amongst us, here and now, current activity. Grace, accept it. Let it in. Do yourself a favor. Allow grace to silence the critics, or to silence your inner critic. Allow grace to come and soothe your guilty conscience. Allow grace to speak to that voice that says you are not worthy. Allow grace to meet with you. Let Jesus in. It's the best decision you'll make. He promises to meet you where you're at. He promises to soothe the pain. He promises to take away the shame and the guilt. He promises to satisfy your innermost desires. And so, band, why don't you come on up? And as we get ready to sing another song of worship, let me ask you the questions that I asked you earlier. Are you one of the people here tonight who are wondering who Jesus is? Well, tonight, do you want to finish that journey and put Jesus first? Are you a religious or spiritual person? Tonight, do you want to stop resisting him, put your faith in him, and renounce any reliance on any other systems or practices? Are you the woman? Are you sat here full of shame and guilt? And do you need to meet with Jesus tonight and accept the offer of grace on the table? Are you a believer in Jesus, and do you need to be reminded that he loves you no matter what? Why don't we stand? And we're going to sing one more song, and after that song we'll have a time of ministry.